Yeah, so I stayed up all night so I could watch season 4 of Drive to Survive Formula One, and my eyes hurt. But I did it, and I put pants on. There's no American Formula One fans. Yeah, so a little background before we get into actually talking about the show. I got into F1 a couple years ago. I didn't end up watching the first season of this show, Drive to Survive, because I had sort of watched the F1 season, but I wasn't paying close enough attention to really benefit from it. But then I got really into Formula One and the seasons, and so the subsequent seasons 2 and 3 I watched right when they came out because I was following Formula One at that point. I'm an American. Sorry. I will say I think the show Drive to Survive seasons 2 and 3 that I saw are okay, but I personally get way more out of actually following the race weekend, and so there's just something that I'm getting out of sort of the nerdy stuff and especially the technical stuff of the Formula One race weekend that Drive to Survive sort of doesn't really tackle. It is what it is. I will admit, I do think the Netflix show gives us an opportunity to see these famous individuals and teams as people who like do people things, which is great because the other ways to do it, unless you follow like Lando Norris's like Instagram, is just press briefings and then the race weekend, and they're all press trained. I feel like Formula One has a sort of different definition of press trained than a lot of sports, but yeah, they understand how to deal with the press. I also got to admit that I'm super into sort of the midfield tiers of teams and drivers. I mean, I think Max and Lewis are awesome, and they're the elites of what they're capable of doing. But I find it more interesting the scrappy ones. On my list, I have McLaren, AlphaTauri, Alpine, Ferrari, kind of. The drivers that I really like: Pierre Gasly, George Russell, Lando Norris. Danny Rick, Kimi Räikkönen, who I think we see like 2 frames of him in this whole show, and that's just what it is. I will say that, a lot of what goes on in Formula One, the show missed. I wrote a list, but I realized I'm probably not the right person to even go through that list, so I, leave it to other YouTubers to actually clinically go through all the things the show missed. I don't think it's me. Yeah, so for what it's worth, I started this show at 2 a.m., which is when it became available to me at my time. I finished it at about 9, so that's about 7 hours with a bunch of bathroom breaks and snack breaks. So it was weird, though, because I wrote down sort of how long Netflix said each episode was going to be, and then when I checked against it, it seemed to not be super accurate. So I don't know if that was a typo that they just kept putting in, or whether, in the middle of the night I just wrote the numbers down wrong, but it seemed like a lot of them were longer than like the 31 minutes that Netflix told me they were. But again, I could be wrong about all of this. Yeah, so I want to talk about the story of the show. I like to treat shows and scripts and everything like their own thing. That's really hard to do with Formula One because there's an entire universe that is Formula One, and this is a very narrow sort of sliver of the point of view of it. But I am going to do my best to treat this show as its own thing, acknowledging Formula One is many more things. The first couple episodes, there was a lot of explaining of Formula One to it was sort of like a teaser of what you could do with Formula One. Like the first couple episodes especially felt like sort of teaser trailers for Formula One, the experience, I guess. So there was a lot of like hand-holding, a lot of explaining stuff. It's not for me. By like episode 4 or 5, they pretty much abandoned doing that and just assumed you understand enough about the show to keep watching it, which, sure, okay. Yeah, so the way the show is structured, and it's not any different from the other seasons, but it kind of gives me like an Animorphs or like a Lost vibe, where instead of tracking things sort of as time goes by, you basically start with a new character or a new group every episode, and you sort of follow them through the season, which is their way of doing it. I just found it to be kind of weird that we were constantly starting over, and it was hard to sort of unravel all the timelines because they would skip around, and like what was important in one race never came up in other episodes, that kind of thing. I mean, this show specifically doesn't seem to really track the flow and the dynamics of like what a race weekend is, which is what I vibe off of the most. They went a completely different way with it and how they tell their story. I just think it's worth acknowledging that the race weekend has its own sort of like twists and turns and flow of how things goes. which ends up in a build up towards, Sunday when they actually race. A lot of what throws me about the show itself is sometimes there's just no real context, and the show, it feels like produced, like they're making context out of nothing, which has been a criticism of the show in the past. And I do see that here. In the TV industry, it's called producing. Producing a docuseries, for instance, which is what Netflix is making this. There's like an artificiality to it that, knowing what I know about Formula One now, I don't know if it's necessarily helpful to do it this way, but it is sort of the format they've chosen to do it in. One of my other big takeaways from watching it is it did feel like Netflix was only around for certain episodes or certain race weekends, and so they were just missing stuff, and they had to sort of edit around stuff they didn't have. And it wasn't just like individual events, but it was also like my brain wants to see like the overhead, like helicopter shot of the race. And I guess Netflix just doesn't have access to that, or didn't get permission or something, because you never see it. Because that's how I can track the race the easiest. And sometimes it'll like zoom in on a monitor that's showing it, but it's not the same thing as like the overhead shot where you're actually watching the race in real time. This is especially true in sort of qualifying, where you can track, sectors and how fast drivers are going. That was very unclear and just not handled very efficiently, I feel like, compared to how actually Formula One actually does it. Yeah, and so the fact that they missed, stuff that I would have put into the story myself, or stuff that I assumed was necessary to the story, yeah, some of it just feels thin. Like the storylines feel a little bit underdeveloped, and there's just not enough footage. Maybe that's just how I took it, because I know the larger context, even though I'm trying not to put that onto it. So yeah, I did have a different way of how I would have sort of presented the material, because it kind of does seem like each team or each producing team or whatever sort of just like took a story and ran with it, and then that's sort of how they developed episodes. And so they all they were connected, but they weren't connected. Whereas my brain thinks of like a rally movie, or like a historical or a docu series where you follow the timeline of events and you jump back and forth between groups of characters and stuff chronologically. And they just abandoned that format altogether in favor of basically telling like a character story each episode that exists in the same universe, which I feel like muddles everything a lot, especially because it was really obvious, like the 4 or 5 major races that Netflix went to, because they kept referencing that at different points in different episodes. I will admit, the episodes started to feel a little bit redundant, not only in the format, but just in sort of the fact that, every race team has that big one race that they, is important to them. By episode 7, that kind of felt like we've been doing this a lot. Admittedly, by, episode 9 and 10, that's when it really focuses on the big end of the season, which was the whole controversy that I don't really feel like getting into. Yeah, but, like I'd say 6, 7, 8, just, why are we still kicking the ball around like this? There were notable characters missing, and I think probably they just didn't get permission, or they just didn't have enough material, or honestly, the producers were just like, it's not worth our time. But there's some very big personalities in Formula One, and some of them were acknowledged, like Lando Norris, Danny Rick, obviously Max and Lewis. But people that were missing pretty heavily were, Kimi Räikkönen's not in it at all, which is sad because he retired. So, spoilers, I guess, but that's not even covered. And Kimi is my all-time favorite Formula One driver just because of how he is in press conferences, because he's, the Iceman. Also, Fernando, Sebastian, to a lesser extent Lance Stroll, because, whatever. It kind of harkens back to the thin thing, like they didn't have enough footage, but again, it might have just been they just decided creatively it wasn't worth their time to pursue Formula One drivers who have been pretty upfront about the fact that they don't want to interact with the Netflix show. So Lewis is included in that, I'm pretty sure, but maybe I'm talking out of school. In case I missed it, also Checo until the last episode, Pierre pretty heavily, Max on his own, Lewis on his own, which I get, they're busy, especially those two, because they have, championships to win. I did realize that I don't remember this being from the other seasons, but the amount that they swear and the way that they swear is exactly the way I do it. So I feel like we're, at least in the English language, we've all sort of converged on sort of the same format of how we talk mostly. There's different dialects, but it's very funny how The things they said, especially on radio, especially Yuki Tsunoda, who English is not his first language, he talks exactly the way I would talk on the radio if I was doing it. So that was actually like awesome. And they kind of acknowledged it a little bit, especially with Yuki on his radio, because he was so bombastic, let's say. But it was really entertaining to see just how much everybody swore, and the fact that everybody pretty much had the same like 3 words that they would use, and they would just cycle through them just the way we all do it. The show has been guilty of and continues to either villainize and or humanize specific characters, especially the owners, and Michael Massey, and the frickin' Haas team boss, Guenther Steiner, who is just like a slapstick character in every single season, as I recall, and he's the same character again. He's just silly for the silly sake, I guess. It'd be really interesting to interact with him to see how ridiculous he is in real life, because I'm not convinced he's as ridiculous as he is portrayed, because he is just the heel of every situation. But also, like, Christian Horner and Toto Wolff are famously terrifying people, and we get a little bit of that how they're terrifying and that they're really intense and they're kind of like type A personalities in their own independent ways. But then they did this whole thing where they try to humanize each of them. You saw horseback riding, you saw Wolf's wife especially seems to really take the edge off. But at the end of the day, these guys are really intense, like famously, like, for lack of a better word, terrible people, who are in huge amounts of power and pressure, doing terrible things to one another and other people. So it was very strange that they really went out of their way to try to humanize these people who are basically just like Steve Jobs of Formula One. I also thought it was hilarious that Matteo Bonanno, the Ferrari team boss, basically only did everything in Italian. Like, every time they talked to him, pretty much he did it in Italian. I thought that was solid. That was really great. The other thing was there was like a string where they did a little bit of Mazepin and his dad is exactly as terrifying as I assumed he would be. So if anything, they should have done more with that guy, but I understand why they didn't. And, context being what it is now, it's kind of good that they shied away from that. I mean, the last 2 episodes were dedicated to the final race and sort of the big controversy and all the things that happened. And honestly, that is such a dense subject that's been analyzed so heavily, especially in the YouTube community, that it kind of deserves its own documentary on its own. There's so much there, and I feel like they just barely scratched the surface, especially of the timetable of how the decisions were made that caused such like a bad situation for everybody. But I do think it's important that made the show, not only because it's, dramatic and it's good TV, but it really does call into question the fact that these people are human and they're making human mistakes in real time, just like anybody else, because once you add pressure to the system, people make the wrong choice. I'm not saying how it turned out is wrong or right. I have my own opinion about that, but at the end of the day, it was interesting to watch these people really suffer the consequences of the pressure that they're under. And that's pretty much what I have about the show, like as a review or as an overview, just because, there's definitely more than it could have done, because it was absolutely like an astounding season of pretty incredible racing. I was completely blown away, whereas I feel like earlier seasons that I'd watched, not of the show, but of the actual sport, seemed kind of boring and predictable, whereas this was, if anything, confusing, which was kind of nice for a change. But yeah, when I actually do what I didn't want to do, which is compare it to the actual F1 race weekend experience, I consume so much YouTube. I watch the feeds. I watch the breakdowns. I watch all the technical stuff, and that's the stuff that sort of makes me interested. So yes, the Netflix show is interesting in its own way, but it just doesn't go. It's sort of the book was better kind of a situation for me. So maybe this is a way to get more fans. I mean, it seems to be a successful Netflix series, but it just didn't seem as thorough as something I would have wanted. But it was nice to experience what I did, because about every episode something interesting happened that I wasn't aware of. Mostly in the interactions between people, but how much of that was actually produced, I don't know. So yeah, some final takeaways about the show itself. Drive to Survive season 4. Sure, it's a thing. I mostly enjoyed it. Did I get the crazy adrenaline rush and the intensity and all that kind of stuff that I do from a race weekend and seeing, the qualifying laps and the big fights around the corners, during the race and all that kind of stuff? Only a couple times and not in a huge way. I did stay up all night and I'm exhausted and my eyes hurt, so that's probably part of it. But, the race weekend is superior to me. I think it's a good way to kind of meet the drivers and the team bosses because they are sort of press isolated, and this is a different way to do it for those who are interested, because many of the drivers either didn't have time or just recognize it to be bad for their whatever image. I just don't think the show had enough access to footage, especially sort of the overhead racing, and they should have just been at more race days. I kind of understand why they didn't, and it might have been a push and pull between Formula One itself because that's its own giant machine. But it did seem like an unfinished, unrefined version of what I consider to be a very highly refined sporting experience. At the end of the day, it is what it is. Watch it or don't. That's not really up to me. I watch it as a companion to the actual Formula One experience, but I'd say 90% of my Formula One experience is YouTube, and this is the other 10%. And with that, I look forward to the new Formula One season. God, I had so many things to say about Nikita Mazepin, but, if you're watching it by now, the news has broke that Kevin Magnussen has swapped him out, so it's kind of a moot point other than, he almost killed other drivers over and over again, and that's not okay, but he's out now, and I think Mick Schumacher's life is going to be infinitely easier now. So, yeah, so enjoy the show. The season's coming back. We're in second round of testing, and I'm super excited. So, hooray. I feel like I should acknowledge this. There's a Russian invasion of Ukraine going on right now, and that's not okay. I would like to urge the Russian people to stop Putin. I think that's something the Russian people could do. If this is here, I forgot to do a tag, or they all sucked.